which he considered to be an inland lake. But we are now at a phase, 20 years after the end of the Cold War, where it's not a whole lot different than what Walter Lippmann talked about 65 years ago or more. Our foreign policy is in many ways insolvent. We are going after goals which were defined on the basis of emotion. We are forgetting the foundations that we built over 65 years or 45 years after the war. And we are defining a future, and by the way, the Bush and the Obama administrations have had essentially the same foreign policy. The Obamas talk a little bit calmer, but it's essentially the same goal, and that is to spread American exceptionalism around the world. And if there's one thing which we can't be doing right now is spreading American exceptionalism. I don't have anything against it. I like being an American, and I think we are exceptional, but we also have to be smart. And if you read the new biography, which has just come out on George Kennan, who was one of America's great diplomats, but also one of America's most frustrated diplomats, because he couldn't figure out a way to overcome the drag of this exceptionalism. So my first conclusion for all of this is that when we talk about why Europe is important, we should first understand that both the Europeans and the Americans are becoming very provincial at the moment, and are not really thinking or talking about what they need to be thinking or talking about. They're thinking and talking about being Europe and being American. From there comes my second conclusion. I won't even tell you anything about it. I'm just going to jump to it, which is that what we think we're doing together, which is working on the world's problems, is not enough. We cannot have, as some of the analysts call it, a transactional foreign policy, for a lot of reasons which I'm going to talk about later too. A transactional foreign policy looks at problems as problems. You have North Korea, you have Iran, you have Iraq, you have Syria, you have Sudan, you have whatever. And you try to find a solution. This is our foreign policy right now. There isn't any sense of any kind of direction to it or any kind of context to it. And in a world, it's very interesting, in a world which is becoming increasingly networked every day on the basis of high-speed IT, etc., both the United States and the Europeans are deciding that they don't need to have any context. They're just going to look at what they think to do. And so if we're going to deal with the future, we have to understand, and this is another reason why Europe matters, that we can't have a transactional foreign policy. We have to have one which has a certain context to it. And then I will jump to my third conclusion already, and that is, I've already sort of stated it, that you cannot survive in this world simply by looking at each problem individually. You'll be eaten up by that. And we have a good historical example for that. A country we all like, the United Kingdom, was eaten up in the 19th century by this kind of transactional foreign policy. The British in the 19th century believed that their interests were well served by stopping the building of structures or alliances. In particular, they wanted to keep Europe, excuse me? Can you get a little closer to the mic? I thought I had a mic right here which was saying all this, but it's not working. That's why I have this mic here, but it's not working. I don't know, is there an expert here who knows?
That's actually for a video, that's not.
Oh, that's not for the...
Oh, I see, okay, sorry, I didn't realize that.
Okay, I don't know if there's any...
Yeah, okay. Oops, I can't get too close to it because it'll fall down. In any case, the United Kingdom did exactly the same thing. And by 1900, the United Kingdom had been essentially wasted by the effort of fighting foreign wars. There may be a certain comparison that we can make with the United States today. We would have a very small budget deficit if we hadn't been fighting foreign wars for the past 10 years. But you cannot do that, and that's my point. You cannot have a transactional foreign policy in which you just try to pick up problems as they arise. And maybe tomorrow the big problem is going to be in, let's say, Malaysia. And if we haven't had any context for Malaysia, we'll just go there and try to do Malaysia. This, in the world that we're entering into, this won't work. And the Europeans don't understand this, and the Americans don't understand this. But my third conclusion is that the real challenges today are not China, even China, which everybody considers to be our major, almost disaster coming up ahead, which won't be. But you cannot now just look at the world as these challenges. The real challenge which is ahead of us, and which you all are going to be very much involved in, is dealing with what I would call a fundamental remapping of the world. The world, during the past 10 years, mostly without people noticing it, we have merged into a new kind of world where existing concepts of cooperation, of integration, of diplomacy have been overtaken by a sort of 24-hour integrated world in which the major initiative is not on the side of governments or on rebel movements or even Al-Qaeda. Those are the challenges of the past. But through our own inventiveness, through the actions of large American and European corporations, increasingly also Chinese corporations, through the evolution of high-speed information technology, which is essentially a product of Western technology. What this has done is changed the concepts of time and space, so that you cannot now, even the very large and very successful United States can't believe that it can run a policy based on its own geographic or its own political dynamic. And the best example of this is, in fact, the Euro crisis. The European leaders are trying to use the methods of the past. They're trying to define Europe within the framework of the Rome Treaty. And they are trying, as Chancellor Merkel says quite often, to somehow get a hold of the markets and force them to follow political leadership. Well, guess what? The markets are never going to follow this political leadership because they are living in a whole different world. And the world that they're living in is increasingly a parallel world to the world that politicians are living in. And I talk with lots of business leaders when in my job in Berlin, and I had, for example, a discussion with the head of Dow Chemical, a very big American company, 3-4 weeks ago. And I asked him about this, and he said, well, all I can tell you is we don't even speak the same language as the political leadership. And we don't know how to tell them what we're up to. And so what's happening is that the transatlantic community is being subsumed into a much larger global community, which at the moment, however, and this is a point which I consider to be extremely important, is developing outside of the framework of political leadership, with very small exceptions. And the people, for example, in Germany, there's a big campaign almost against hedge funds and traders and people like this saying that they're trying to undermine Europe. But of course, the problem is they don't even know who these people are. And I do because I talk to them. They tend to be very conservative young people who would never think of undermining any government, who spend money for pension funds. And they have to be as conservative as they can because they believe that they are, in fact, investing the money of people who want to use it for their retirement. And they have just decided Europe is a bad place to invest. Now, is this speculation? Is this somehow an attack against the European Union? It's not. What it is a demonstration that if the European Union doesn't perform, that the new kind of world that we're in, a benchmarked world based on integrated networks, etc., will simply ignore them, or worse, sometimes destroy them. So we are living now in a new industrial revolution. It is a microelectronic revolution, an information technology revolution, but it has the same effect as railroads and the telegraph had in the 19th century. And the urgency of what I'm trying to say can be demonstrated by what happened in the 20th century. The political leadership in the 19th century did not believe that it was necessary to adjust to these new forces. They did not believe that it was important to find a way of dealing with the new economy of those days. And in the end, they were chewed up by it. And we ended up with a century of warfare. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to be the result this time, but what I am arguing is that this remapping of the world which is going on is as fundamental as that which happened in the 19th century. It will blow away institutions. If you remember that the 19th century began with the Napoleonic Wars, in the second decade of the 19th century, the old aristocratic regimes got together and at the Congress of Vienna and tried to build up a bulwark against change, and that they fought for the next 75 years not to change, and when it exploded, it really exploded. Now, the same thing is happening, if I may say so, I don't know, without trying to draw too many direct consequences, with the European Union at the moment. It has a vision of itself and an ideology which came out of the destruction of the last industrial revolution, and they believe that they too have found the answer to stability, and they are fighting change harder than you can imagine. Now, as I said, the United States isn't a whole lot better, but we have an advantage that they don't have, and that is that we do have an intact identity, we do have an intact market, and we do have the ability to change more rapidly than they do. But the stakes are very high. If the United States and Europe don't break out of their provincialism, we're not going to have another war, I don't think. I hopefully think we're past that point. But we could find that much of the foundation of our democracy, much of the foundation of our prosperity, and much of our ability to deal with the future will be weakened. And you can see it already in the way the United States, take a look at the President's defense policy statement of a couple of weeks ago, where he took the really unprecedented decision to go to the Pentagon, to go to the Defense Department, and himself present what essentially was the job of the Secretary of Defense, to present a new defense strategy. Why did he do this? Because he was trying to tell us that we were entering a new era of American defense policy. I think he was also trying to get some credit for getting us out of Iraq, to tell you the truth, and Afghanistan, but that's his business, he can do that. But he was doing something more. He was saying that we had overdone it in the past, and our defense policy in the future was going to have to be a lot different. And the Europeans are finding the same thing now with the euro. Europeans haven't been a major military power since World War II, but they certainly are a major economic power. And they're now finding that the same kind of, shall we say, particularism, which the United States had done with its defense policy, is now not going to be possible for them either. Now, my next conclusion is that there are going to be consequences for politicians and also consequences for diplomacy out of all this. And our current sort of zero-sum politics, as I would call it, where there always has to be a winner and a loser. The approach we're taking to China right now, which is to warn everybody that China is going to be a big aggressive power and that we have to have more aircraft carriers in the Pacific. The president goes and does this. Chris can probably analyze this better than me as an Asian expert. He's going to station 2,500 Marines in Australia, which is going to make the Chinese think over whether they're going to have an aircraft carrier or not. I mean, this, excuse me for being sarcastic, but this is all nonsense. The real relationship we're going to have with China is not a zero-sum big power relationship. It's going to be a relationship of operating these global networks. The International Business Machines Corporation, IBM, has transferred its entire R&D section to Shanghai. Is this a country that we're getting ready to have a war with? I don't think so. Every major American company has major investments in China. Germany has, I'll come to Germany in a moment, but Germany has essentially shifted its foreign policy. If there are any Germans here, they'd get angry at me for saying this, but this is what's happened. Germany has shifted its foreign policy away from Europe in the direction of Asia, because they know that that's where they are going to keep their industry at the high peak that it's now at. In other words, there's a whole different game going on. This is what I've been arguing. And in the future, we're going to understand this game, and that diplomacy will no longer be the kind of sort of you win, I lose, or I win, you lose kind of stuff that we learned, but rather it's going to be people who learn how to run networks. And somebody who is the head of Chinese affairs in the State Department is going to talk about how do we keep China in balance with Southeast Asia, with Europe, with Russia, and with the United States. It's not going to be this kind of stuff. And if you read, and I hope you do read it, the book that Henry Kissinger just published on China, which is just an amazing thing to read, except if I may be so bold, its conclusions are wrong. He says the United States and China are going to decide the future of the world. The United States and China are not going to decide the future of the world. They're going to decide it together with Brazil and with India and with the Comoros Islands and anybody else who can play a role. Networks, which are well understood phenomena, are places with no center. But networks are also places where people can make great profit and great gain if they know how to work them. The United States right now doesn't know how to work networks, even though our own country is a very good example of a network. And over the next years, diplomats, maybe hopefully some of you, will be learning how to run a diplomacy based on networks and not on, shall we call it, zero-sum relationships. So, why is Europe important? It is not important for most of the reasons that the Europeans tell you it's important for. It's not important because it's a unifying factor which is going to be a big power and is going to be a major player on the world scene. It is not important because it is the most innovative place in the world, because it's not. It is important because it is the largest, larger even than we are, democratic, free market, and just society on earth. It is important because it joins us in believing that these principles of democracy and openness and free markets ought to be the basis for the new world order, as sometimes people say, as we hoped they would be and as we achieved considerably to have them be in the old era. It is the place where we have not friends, but close relatives. It is the place, and I can tell you, I've spent over half my life living in Europe, where you can feel that you're in your society, even though it may be different and maybe the French are nasty to you and everything. You can deal with that. You know, you can deal with it because you know that you're in fact in a place where the vision of humankind that you have is the same there. And this is going to be the most important factor of the future. Not that military is not going to be important. Our economic strength is going to be essential. Our technology, as I've said, is the thing which has already built this world. But what we need, what we have not come up with yet, is a cultural answer to globalization. In fact, we're far from it. And we're especially far from it in a growing gap of communication between the leaders of technology who are building this integrated world and our political leadership and also our cultural leadership. They are increasingly, as I quoted the chairman of Dow Chemical, they're increasingly unable to talk with each other. And so what I would urge you as you go forward, hopefully working in international careers, is, I'll be careful when I say this, don't take too seriously what you're learning here at the Kornblum Center. What you're learning is history. And what you're learning is a way to think. And when I was in your shoes, I don't have a graduate degree, so I'm not quite as educated as you are, but when I was studying international relations, the whole context that I was given was the Cold War. The Russians are bad, we're going to beat the Russians. And I spent the next 25 years dealing with how to end the Cold War, starting with détente. I took part in the first détente negotiation, the quadripartite negotiations on Berlin in 1970, believe it or not. I was very young, I hasten to add. And I spent the rest of the time unlearning what I had learned at college. And so I'm not being critical when I say this. I'm, in fact, urging you to utilize the foundation that you're getting here. First, to understand how things work, and secondly, how to think about how things work. But then to look in the new directions of where things are happening. And as a postscript, I told Chris I was going to say this, I would like to address also universities. Because I think that what is happening is that this integrated world is rushing past not just our politicians, but also our universities. And I would in fact urge you to think in your curriculum, either at the Kornblum Center or at the university in general, get some people who know about network behavior, who know about extended value chains and network situations.